So hello and welcome to our ACES conversation on relational leadership. Our guests today are Stephen Slessor. Stephen is the Managing Director of Galliford Tri's environment, and we'll find out a little bit more about that business in just a second. And Mike Stephenson, who is the Managing Director of Thinktastic. And without giving too much preamble, I would like these gentlemen to tell us exactly what their businesses do. So, Stephen, if I could come to you first, hello and welcome. It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us today. We are very, very grateful. Tell me about Galliford Tri's environment and what you do.
Good evening, Gary. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the welcome. So Galliford Tri is a construction company in Scotland. You'll know us as Morrison Construction. And that's been where I've been for the last 15 years. Galliford Tri covers all the United Kingdom, and I look after their environment business. So principally we do civil engineering and process works, mainly with water companies. We do flood alleviation schemes. We build fantastic structures like the Queensferry Crossing. Very proud to have been involved in that scheme. And yeah, my business turns over around £200 million a year. I employ about 1,000 people plus the supply chain. And I cover all the way from Shetland to Southampton. So a good distance.
Wow. So a tiny brief then. A tiny brief, Stephen. That's amazing. I didn't know you did the crossing. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I was a JV board director on that particular project for a couple of years towards its conclusion. But I was involved at the very early stage in some of the planning of that project as well. Absolutely incredible feat of engineering. And do you know something? It was all designed and constructed in Scotland by Scottish people. You know, yeah, there's some people that came from overseas in various parts of the world as part of the team, but the actual work was done locally. And I'm really proud of that.
Quite right, too. Quite right. Stephen, great to have you here. Mike Stephenson, I love the name of your business, Thinktastic. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, my role now is really to ignite the enthusiasm of people in and out of work. I think most people are only half cooked at the moment. And it's really important that in the workplace in particular, you know, people have got a voice, feel passionate about where the organization is going, understand what the organization's vision is, and have their purpose aligned. Because basically it's about releasing people to be what they can be at work. And, you know, when you give people those kind of, widen the parameters at work, and, you know, you move people from being policy victims to policy entrepreneurs, then you've unleashed, you know, a giant in an organization. So I do motivational speaking, I do motivational writing as well, because words are really important. And so often, you know, we are faced with a paragraph, a set of words which are incomprehensible. And, you know, I do try and clarify for my clients as well. So I do speaking and I do writing and I do creative workshops. And more recently, I think it's fair to say that during COVID, I've been doing sessions which are taking people through the whole kind of journey, you know, starting with well-being and purpose and ending up with how far you can go. And this is a really, you know, it's an ignition of, you know, the new way forward. So that's what Thinktastic is. It does what it says in the tin, really.
Love it, Mike. Half cooked. So are you suggesting from that we in organizations and businesses don't get as much out of those individuals who work in those organizations and businesses? We don't push them to their full potential?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. The worst thing I ever heard a manager say to a member of staff was, "You're not paid to think," which is the worst possible kind of denigration of any individual, because you don't employ anyone not to think. And so I do think that people keep their best outside work, and that they hang up their personality and a lot of their talents when they arrive at work in the morning. And I think that's really sad. And when you see that situation changed It's explosive. The energy changes, and of course productivity goes up dramatically. So yes, I do think people are half-cooked at work.
Stephen, both you and Mike have got incredible backgrounds when you read your biogs, and you've got fantastic, successful careers. I'd love you to share for the audience and for myself a little bit more about your backgrounds and how that relates into adverse childhood experiences, because that is the core of the conversation tonight. So it'd be really interesting just to find out a little bit more, Stephen, if I could come to you about your background and your upbringing.
Absolutely, Gary. So it's quite interesting. I said to the team here when we agreed to do this that I could tell you what I know about relational leadership in the back of a stamp, because I didn't see what relationship leadership was about until I actually looked at some of the characteristics. And then I realized actually I probably do have a lot of these characteristics, but I suppose part of that relational leadership piece is not realizing you have them, if that makes sense. But certainly from my background, when we talk about childhood trauma or childhood, I was brought up in a very small northern town in north of England. In fact, you can see just behind me the beautiful Lake District. I'm from a small town called Penrith. My father is Italian and did the off before I was born. And so I was brought up in a single parent family in a northern town, very working class community. And with a different skin color a little bit at times, and you were just different. So that made you sort of rich pickings for bullying, abuse, and that went all the way through. But you know what? I think I felt that I came from a really loving family. I was really blessed to have strong. My mother was really strong. My grandfather was really strong. Came from a really strong background. And they sort of almost brought into me that being different wasn't bad. It was the early, they call it inclusivity and diversion now, Gary. But in those days, it was you're just different, you're weird. And so because you're different, you need to be isolated and you need to be dealt with. So I had a really sort of challenging sort of upbringing amongst like friends and being at school and it wasn't very pleasant. But as I went through, and as soon as I got out of school, I became a very different person because I didn't have that emotional baggage that was sort of hanging around me at a regular basis. And I went to art college for 2 years, which was an incredible experience. I mean, I loved my time there, but I was absolutely rubbish at it. So I left there at 18 with my national diploma in media studies. And, the world is your oyster, but I ended up getting into the pub trade. I was a licensee for a couple of years. I spent a lot of time seeing people at their lowest ebb. And I think when you see people in that space, you actually learn so much about what makes people tick. And I think I've always said that my career in construction and civil engineering was founded upon the premise of being understand people and being able to communicate at them a very simple and straightforward level. And so after I left the pub business, I worked in mobile entertainment. So I was a DJ. I did sort of gigs and things like that. Then I went on to do, I got a job in construction as a site operative, as a labourer, guy on the shovel. And I have literally worked my way up from the guy in the shovel. 20 years ago, I started in that game. And every time I've had an opportunity, I've taken it. And I went to night class, did day release, just every time something came along. But all the way through that, being able to understand and get people on side. Fundamentally, when you get to be like where I'm at the moment as managing director, you're a politician. You're a social worker and a politician. They're your two core functions, because you can't do anything unless you can get your people to do things for you. And if you don't have the kind of creative, innovative, empowered space to do that, you'll get nothing done. So if anybody, and from my perspective, I touched on this earlier in the pre-chat, was that relational leadership isn't about anything that you're doing or badging yourself as that. It's a positive choice that you make at any stage in your career. You can be a leader, doesn't matter what space you are. So, hence, and that's how I got to where we are now, Gary, I suppose, part of history.
Great story, Stephen. And I think it's really important that we understand, your background and your backgrounds and where you're coming from in this discussion, in this story. Mike, what about you? I know some of your background, but I'd love you to share it with the audience.
Well, I think I have to abbreviate at this quite a lot. I hated school. I wasn't brought up in poverty. My father was a teacher. My mother was Lebanese, and so I had this thing about being from a half-immigrant family as well, so I can relate to some of the stuff that Stephen talks about as well. I was relentlessly bullied by people as well, but the earliest memory I have of feeling this sense of rejection was actually at primary school, and it was a rejection by a teacher. Now, if I explain the story very quickly, he used to sit boys on his knee during break time, and he never invited me onto his knee, and I felt rejected. And I told my father, and he rushed to the school in anger. And of course, you know the rest of the story. The teacher was dismissed. He did a record of doing this before. But I hated every minute of school. I went to Kirkcaldy High School. I was a contemporary of Gordon Brown, who did rather better than me academically. In fact, he was one of these accelerated classes, applying for university when he was 13 or something. And I went in the opposite direction, and I was asked to leave at the age of 15. So I left feeling utterly stupid, but at the same time, sniffing the breath of perfumed air, the scent of perfumed air, because I really hated school. It was like being in prison for me. And then my parents started, falling apart, and the family was going through a very difficult time. So I went down to London to escape all of that. And I got a job, and things were going quite well. I was working in a shop until I was sacked 3 weeks later, because none of the customers apparently could understand a word I said. So I was summarily dismissed, and the bed and breakfast I was staying in, I went back to the landlady and said, I'm sorry, I've lost my job. What do you think I should do? And she said, well, if you've got no money coming in, you're not staying in this bed and breakfast. Please, pack up your stuff and go. So I ended up sleeping out in the streets for quite a number of months, a year, and it was a very formative experience. I mean, it was hard, it was cold sometimes, and I had experiences then that really have shaped me for the rest of my life. And I'll tell you what the first one was. It was a night in December, and it was really cold, and I was huddled up in Piccadilly Circus, and this Commer van drew up alongside me, and this woman jumped out, and she told me she was from this charity, and she was going to take me to this hostel, and I would be given overnight accommodation, and the next morning they would help me find something a bit more permanent. So I thought, yes. I arrived at this place in Peckham in London, and it was a bit Disney-esque, the dark building with the moonlit sky behind it. And I was taken into this tiled room, and I was told to take my clothes off. And the next thing I knew, there was a hose pointed at me and unleashed. And I felt, small. I felt so belittled. And I realized then, this is a very early part of communication for me, that I was not looking for somewhere to stay above everything else. I was looking to feel significant, to feel valued, to have, a history, to have a name even. And I didn't get any of that. So I escaped back into the streets, because at least there I had dignity. Now, from there, I went and I busked in Dublin, did it quite successfully. And then I had about 29 jobs by the time I was 26. Building, steel, biscuits, wine, packing suits in Moss Brothers. I can't even remember half the jobs, but I had some hideous experiences of leadership, where you are a unit of production. Now, this was in the late 60s going into the early 70s. And some of the workplace practices were appalling. Some of the ways that you were treated as an employee were awful. And I had one positive experience, which I may come to later. But then I went on and I did complete education. I did, I got my hires, and when I was about 23, I then went to Napier in Edinburgh and did communication studies. And then years later, I did an MBA. So I wasn't stupid, but I did have a talent for speaking, for performing, for getting on with people, for championing the underdog. And interestingly, in almost every workplace I was in until the late 70s, I was appointed shop steward. I was 17, I was appointed shop steward. I was 21, I was appointed shop steward, which told me something. Most of these jobs were down south. And it told me that, there was something I had. I didn't know what it was, but I think it was a slow realization. And then I set up in business. And when I was 43, had a very good, successful business. It got trashed during the recession. And Thinktastic came along as a kind of reprieve for me and an assault on the doom and gloom that was around at the time.
I want to go back to what you were saying about the 70s, the 80s, and Stephen, I'm going to come to you on this as well. Is that I started my career in '89, right? And it was almost like the word. I love my job, right? But it's like the word empathy hadn't even been invented, and a lot of the prevailing attitudes of management at the time were it's my way or the highway. Really interested, Mike, that you had the position of shop steward. Were you seen as leaders as a bit of a pain in the arse?
Yes, in a word. It's strange because my colleagues seem to like me, and the bosses never liked me. I must have been a nightmare to employ. But, if I turn that round and see with a different approach, I could have been a brilliant asset to any of these organizations. It's extraordinary. But I was not a pain in the ass. I became a pain in the ass because I saw horrible injustices around me. And, I did stick up for other people. And, I saw bullying, I saw violence, I saw all kinds of practices which were... they've tainted me for life. And in a sense, what I've learned from that is something entirely different. And I'm able to work with organizations, I'm able to work with leaders in a way that I think very few can, simply because I've got all this experience. And it does teach you something that books cannot teach.
And you obviously survived that and brilliantly. And I'm talking about when I use that phrase, I'm talking about the perception of management and leaders at the time, and their view of you, being young, being outwardly confident. And I say outwardly because I don't know what was going inside or what was going on inside at that time, but obviously it led you to doing, championing the underdog even to this day.
Yes, absolutely. And it's extraordinary what life can teach you. And the kind of wisdom you can accumulate with age. If you're open-minded, you keep learning, you keep listening to people. I think we've got a fantastic generation of young people who are, coming through now, and I've got real trust in them. But I want to be able to work with them and to be able to give them the confidence to have a voice, because if you don't exercise your voice, someone else will fill the silence. And there are too many people that fill the silence without necessarily having something to say. And I was shocked yesterday. I'm going to go political for a minute. But Boris Johnson said that the vaccine success in this country was a result of greed and capitalism. Now, I think it was a result of something the opposite of that. I think it was a result of international cooperation and people with a real purpose to try and do something about this awful pandemic. So that's an attitude I reject absolutely. And greed, you cannot say to kids, greed's not a good thing, and then tell the nation that all the good things that are coming out of this pandemic are the result of greed.
Stephen, staying on the theme of previous management in the 70s and the 80s, I know that you've had a very, very interesting career in your years in construction. To me, if I look, I've never worked in construction, but if I look from the outside in, Stephen, I think it appears to me to be a very sort of macho, very male orientated industry, and that may well have changed, and that perception may well have changed, over the years. But what sort of challenges, Stephen, have you found in trying to embed relational leadership into the business, bearing in mind that you did say to us that what you thought you knew was on the back of a stamp, but what challenges have you had?
So quite interesting, to be honest, Gary, because, well, first of all, I'm only a young pup, and so I wasn't born till the mid-70s, so I can't share any of Mike's experiences, but interestingly, I do recognise some of the behaviours that Mike talked about there, and I mean, that is rife, and still, I ain't going to sit here and lie to you and say that construction's changed, and we're all full of touchy-feeling thinkers with high levels of emotional intelligence, because we're not. We're in the middle of a journey of change in construction, and we recognise that equality and diversity and inclusion are so important to us. And to be honest, for my view, is that I think we will fail if we do not generate a culture of diversity and inclusion at all levels through absolutely every organisation, and it's not specific to construction, because certainly the biggest challenge, we don't have enough people to do the work that we have, and it's only going to get more and more and more. But in terms of some of the challenges I face, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's this culture of, I would say, of machoism, but do you know what it all boils down to, Gary, in my mind, is that, and this is where the empathy piece comes in, which you talked about earlier, is that people are scared to fail. Part of having a successful environment where people can grow and be nurtured and actually develop the skills that they need to know what it's like when that doesn't happen, and experience the feelings of that, and experience how they don't want that to happen again. But one of the things that businesses don't do very well is actually create an environment where it's okay to fail. So one of the things that I've done is created an environment where it's okay to fail. I mean, don't get me wrong, repeated failure won't be tolerated, but how can I expect people to make decisions or independently if they don't have the ability to actually fail and then keep trying and do something different? And people, I'm just looking at some of the text in the chat about don't use the word fail, but I think I optimize the sort of the general custom industry and practice of people, and that's the word that you will use and people understand. And I accept that it's not a word that some people will like or don't like, but it's a harsh reality. And what I'm about is more about actually understanding the value of what that failure, that attempt has brought to the process of that learning. And so really, because I've been there myself and I've failed so many times at various stages, but because you've got that natural inbuilt resilience from a lot of those childhood experiences, that you just pick yourself back up again and you get on to the next one. And that's not right for absolutely every situation that you'll find. But creating an environment where you have empathy at its core allows people to have I'm going to call a psychological safety net, that they know that you've been in that space, they know you've been through that feeling, and you actually know what it's like to come out the other side. And in its simplest term, that is, and I think a lot of young people need that. I think that people are educated and are brought through the education system to see failures, as being very, very difficult. If you're a failure, you're a failure, and you're labelled like that for the rest of your life. And I like Mike's point earlier when he was talking about he went on to go and do lots of other things that actually proved he wasn't a failure. And I left school with saying to the guys, 3 GCSEs in home economics, geography, and performing arts. Yet, and I was seen to be a bit of a dumpling. Yeah, I got a first class honours degree, a first class master's degree. I'm a visiting professor. I'm president of a big membership organisation of thousands of engineering surveyors. But that just doesn't happen without going through all these different experiences to get there. And so that part of that cultural change that you need to embed in any organisation, forget about construction, is the ability to feel safe and make decisions that aren't always going to work out.
Mike, taking some of Stephen's words into consideration there, and also taking into the consideration that he's the youngest pup on the call tonight, and I acknowledge that. Mike, do you think some of it is generational? Do we still have a hangover of this attitude when we were brought up by teachers and sometimes parents? If we take that failure attitude, how many times was it drummed into people? Failure is not an option. And how many times did we hear that? And do you think that we are slowly getting rid of that generational attitude, Mike?
Well, I hope so. But my most positive experience as an employee was in the construction industry, and it was in 1971. And I was a kind of peripatetic bricklayer's assistant, a hod carrier. And we go from one site to another, and it was very instructional. This is what we want you to do. This is the time scale. And so after all of this, I arrived at a start from scratch site in Earl's Court. And there was a big Welsh foreman with a broken nose and a soft tie. He put his arm around me and he says, "Welcome, Michael. Before you start, I want to show you something." And he showed me the plans and he said, "This is the palace you're building." And suddenly the energy changed completely. I felt this, responsibility for something much bigger than myself. And he was a great leader. And, we had a very diverse, diverse in terms of the male population at that time. But we had Jamaicans, we had Geordies, Irish people, Scots, Liverpudlians, Cockneys, and he brought everyone together. It was extraordinary. And you were allowed to make mistakes. Mistakes were not, unless you killed someone. But I learned so much from his style, which was, you are a vital part of this palace we're building. I'd never felt that before. But in general, we have not left the Industrial Revolution model completely. In teaching, look at schools, you look at rows of desks. The ultimate aim is to get into university. Now, the human race is far more, multifaceted than just having, academic ability. And we have to recognize that. And I have to recognize that in the workplace. I used to interview people in Glasgow for 10 years. I interviewed many, many people for jobs. This was the WISE group, Heatwise, the WISE group in Glasgow, of which I was a founder member in the early 80s. And, people would arrive for an interview. You'd ask them the most, obvious question, tell me something that's good about you. And they would struggle. They would really struggle. So you'd have to delve deeper. You would have to say, what's a typical weekend for you like? And they would say something like, well, I go and get the shopping for the woman next door because she can't get out. And then you bring out all these incredible qualities, which they do not believe are a contributory factor to them going forward. They don't see them as learning experiences. They don't see them as value. And we have to spread our range of evaluation methods because, people are diamond. But what we tend to do is we denigrate them. And it happens at school. And I'm, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I was in a school in West Lothian, and I was going to speak to a class, and a teacher said, before he left the classroom, he left with the class of, I think they were third year. And before he left, he said, right, you lot, zip it. And then he said to me, he says, can you believe this lot? are going to be looking for a job next year. And I thought, he at once has shut them down. It took me about 10 minutes to warm them up and give them the sense that they had something of value to say. So we see this all the time. We see it in signage around our towns and cities. I was speaking in East Lothian, and I was doing a communication strategy for the council. I was speaking to second-year students in a school in Trent, and I turned around the council logo and I said, "What does that say to you?" And this wee boy said, "No ball games, mister." So we actually create an instructional environment, and it isn't just in school. So you go into work expecting to follow the same kind of cultural, development, that you are there to be seen and not heard, there to do something, there to fail. And that's the culture that many people have emerged from. And, it is changing hugely. I think the private sector are doing really well. I know a lot of companies who are Scottish-based at the moment, who are doing extraordinary things, who are celebrating the diversity, who've got all kinds of ways of involving people and giving them a voice and allowing them to be creative in the workforce. I mean, it's a bit like, ideas have no hierarchy, do they? And yet, most businesses are run by the ideas of 2 or 3 people. It's extraordinary. It's almost like saying, we've got limitations. Let's keep those limitations. Let's keep ourselves in this little bubble. And, by the way, the people we employ, a lot of people have this attitude, and I've heard it recently. They're here to take us for a ride, to get their money, to go home at night. We've got the responsibility. They just have to do a job. And it's wrong, because if people have the opportunity to feel that their whole life at work is contributing to something bigger than themselves, like I experienced at a building site, you get a different kind of person. So I think it's changing. I'd like to see it change even faster. And I think business does it better than public services, if I'm honest.
We'll come back to that, Mike, in a second, because I know you've got some very strong opinions, and you're very vocal about that. And I'm sure that we will have some people who are working in education and head teachers viewing this tonight, who we've heard from previously in the series, who actually are making great strides in changing some of the opinions that may have been prevalent in the past. And I think, you may have seen that yourself, particularly with the work that you do. Would you acknowledge that?
Oh, listen, there's been huge strides. I mean, just when I think of my primary school experience and I see primary schools now, I think, wow, if only I'd been in this school when I was young, I would be a different person. And I know head teachers who are doing extraordinary jobs, but they are still restrained by the expectation of, measurement and being compared with other schools. Some are a real disadvantage because they're dealing with, children who have got very low expectations, who have a postcode problem, who don't have parental stimulation, and they're competing with other schools where they've got an entirely different set of circumstances. I think teachers are doing an amazing job. I would leave schools to do much more of their own planning. Honestly, I'm so, anti this national curriculum. I think you can have a basis of a national curriculum, but I think, it's horses for courses. And, when you allow teachers to run with their own head of steam, they can achieve great things with youngsters. I think they're restrained now, to be honest. And I feel sorry for the teaching profession, because I think it's a political football, and they shouldn't be. It should be, the nurturing of our children. And our children have got this extraordinary capacity to learn, to be creative, to find strengths across all sorts of subjects, like music, for example. And, schools are deprived of musical instruments and music teaching. I know this is happening, and that's a shocker for me.
Stephen, there's some really interesting points that Mike is making that I'd like to put to you and pick up on. If we think about adverse childhood experiences, and let's say that we have a difficult employee of which you are responsible for 1,000 plus, and I know you don't manage them all individually, Stephen. But are we quick as leaders to dismiss somebody as being difficult if they if they disagree with us, if they're problematic in the workplace, if there's a degree of bullying going on in a department? Are we quick to shut them down without thinking about what their past experiences, childhood, teenage life was like?
Unquestionably. I see that all the way through, because in business, it's all about results for a lot of people. And I wanted just to pick up a theme which Mike was talking about there in terms of head teachers, of which I absolutely agree with him 100%, by the way. And this obsession with university and academia in that space drives me absolutely balmy. But one of the challenges that you find is that how people measure output or somebody's work or value. So people will measure that as an output of productivity. And so, and you see this quite a lot in the public sector where it's very transactional. And so people are only interested in the monitoring of one result at a time on a performance basis. Where I actually think, if you look at from a relational leadership perspective, I'm really focused on outputs, as in terms of what is somebody delivering. So for example, I don't say to any of my teams that I expect you to work 45 hours a week, because that's what your contract says, and I want you to sit at a desk 9 hours a day and just do that, because you're never going to get any results that you really, really want. Because what you're doing is, and it might touch on it a little bit in terms of the constraints, you're constraining people. The easiest way to get less transactional results, to get the value that you want and need from your people, to help address some of these concepts, and I'll come back to them in a minute, Gary, is really about making sure your people know that I am interested in output. What I'm really interested in is I get to the end of the week and I know that job's been done to that standard. How you do it, where you do it, however you do it within what I call the field of freedom. So you've got your constraints and the things that you need to operate in, company procedures or governance. You go away and you deliver. You be as creative or as innovative. You deal with everything that you need to do within that space. And at the end of the week, all these things will have happened. And that's, in its simplest form, to me, is much more valuable to generate the right behaviours around culture of development, improvement and outcomes. To go back to your point, I suppose, and how that relates to understanding those challenging employees. People are too quick to judge. And managers become managers, certainly in civil engineering, because they are technically very good. So they have a very technical way of doing things, very competent individuals. But what happens is you get to a certain level and then they sometimes get promoted because they need to keep them in the business, and they get put into these managerial roles and they fail. Or it doesn't quite work out for them, or the people leave en masse because those managers aren't educated or being able to understand. Educated is probably the wrong word, but they don't have the right sort of interpersonal skills to be able to empathize, to create a culture of empowerment, to actually challenge some of these behaviors at the root cause and recognize that the problems. It's too hard for them. Companies don't train people to deal with difficult employees in a real granular sense. What they do is they send them on a training course and they tick a few boxes and they get a few paraphrased words and they say, go to HR and that'll sort it out. Nobody actually really wants to understand what those challenges. I'll give you a great example of something that happened to me in my own career, Gary, is that I lost my son to neonatal death 15 years ago. And during that period of time, I made a lot of bad professional decisions because my head just wasn't in the right space. I wouldn't say I was looking not to lose my job because the business understood the context. But anybody else looking in would have just said, oh my God, how can you keep employing this individual without understanding the trauma that was going on in my life at the time? And actually taking a minute to step aside and say, you know what, Steve, you actually need a bit of a break here, or you need additional support. Do you need more time? People are too quick to judge because they work in a fast-paced environment. Now, it's changing. And one of the reasons it's changing is because and my belief is because we want to be a diverse and inclusive society and bring in more compassion. There's been a real significant shift in mental health, for example, within construction. But believe it or not, construction's got one of the highest suicide rates in males. It's incredible. And there's real recognition now, and it's a grassroots movement from the way up. So it is changing, but people are conditioned not to empathize with people because that's seen as a weakness and a threat to them. You go and comply and you get on with your job. The challenge now is, Gary, that might have been fine 20 years ago when there's loads of people in construction. There's not loads of people in construction anymore. You could lose a lot of good people and not bring a lot of people in because of that.
Mike, Stephen's story there about his son showed great vulnerability. How important now is vulnerability in effective leadership, relational leadership?
Well, I think vulnerability is important in everything, because if you try and present this sort of iron hard, impenetrable vision of yourself, then there's nothing human about it. So people, they're not seeing a human being. If you're going to talk to someone about anything and you don't express your vulnerable, I'm not saying you open up and say, look, I'm vulnerable, but people have to see it in your eyes. They have to see that you bleed like they do, that you bring your own anxieties, that you've got your own, backdrop. Because if people understand that what it is life is like to be lived, if people know that you've had your own struggles, and I've had, mental health struggles, I've had, periods of very deep depression. So that has given me an insight. And when I talk, I stand on stage and I'm vulnerable because people wouldn't listen to a bloody word I said if I wasn't being authentic. So I make a business of being vulnerable. Not that I put it on, but you cannot, speak about something. I was talking to AstraZeneca, actually, just before lockdown. Little did they know that their name was going to become a global one at the time. But I was talking to men, but I said, I don't want just men to be there because it was International Men's Day. I didn't know there was an International Men's Day until that day. So they invited all their staff and they came in large numbers. And the number of men that came up to me in their 40s, perhaps early 50s, and said, can I have a word with you? And what they saw was someone who, like them, has faced some of the same challenges that they faced. And that was important. And it was very good for AstraZeneca to open that opportunity for them because they saw, some of my background and they said, we want to bring Mike down from Edinburgh to speak to people. And the reason that they did that was they recognized that if they were going to get their people to open up about themselves, to find some psychological safety in the workplace, then they needed to bring someone in who understood, not as a professional, but as someone who's experienced it. And it was astonishing the number of conversations I had with men who have probably never, ever opened up about themselves before that date. So, this thing about vulnerability, we're all vulnerable. We are all vulnerable. And this kind of toxic masculinity, which we have seen, in politics, we've seen it, out in the streets, we've seen it in the workplace, let's say goodbye to that. Let's just wave it goodbye. Let's dismiss it from our culture because it has had a horrible impact. And, so many lives have been damaged by that. And the whole society has been damaged by that, to be honest. And we've got to say goodbye to that. And we've got to, give men permission to be vulnerable and, give more leadership positions to women, because I think women are far more naturally empathetic and compassionate. And I really do celebrate the acceleration of women into positions of authority. And in Scotland, we're doing well on that. Let's applaud that. So, this is about moving to a new era. This is about a new period in history. I think the next few years is going to be a very exciting time, because I think we're going to see a sea change in the workplace, in the way that countries are run, and in the way that business approaches, what they do. Because, profit, and Steve will know all about profit, but profit's important. But, you're running a false economy if you use people like fodder. If people are merely seen as units of production, you're missing out on all the things that Stephen's talked about, the ability of people to make decisions at a local level, the ability of people to be creative, to make mistakes. Take that out, and you've got, the Industrial Revolution model. And I think we should distance ourselves from that. This is a period of creativity, of compassion, of understanding, of, balancing profit against, the planet and people. And that's the way forward.
Do you know, Mike, social value, it really optimizes that. And I'm really attuned to this, because construction has incredible potential to generate social value for the communities right across Scotland. My biggest frustration is that those public sector bodies that procure don't really recognise that and pay lip service to it. But it would address so much of what you were saying. Sorry, Darren.
No, I'm conscious of our time, and I knew that this would happen because we've got about just over 10 minutes to go. Let's just touch very briefly on the public sector, because I think that would be an episode all by itself. Just dig down a little bit further on that, Stephen, about what the benefits to the public sector would be if they understood a little bit more. Are you talking about financial benefits, community benefits that the construction industry can bring to communities across the UK?
I think it's all of those and more, Gary. I genuinely do believe that. I mean, look at the carbon challenge we've got in front of us at the moment. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, but the bigger challenge is actually the sustainability issue around carbon and a low carbon. We are in the position, we're about to start on a just transition to a low carbon economy. It has the potential to leave so many people behind. Yet you've got an opportunity as you're making this transition to this low carbon economy to really power up local communities across Scotland. And I'm not just talking about local employment, I'm actually talking about constructing really environmentally friendly buildings, low energy buildings, putting carbon right at the centre of decision making. And that's so many other sort of benefits that come with that. But, we as organisations working with public sector that are very driven about best value. But for them, best value always means lowest cost. And that might be lowest capital cost to a particular project, but no one's actually looking at the social and environmental cost of those decisions. Say, for example, actually employment of local people, training young people into a real granular level into industry. One of the biggest barriers that I face in my business is that when we go through procurement, we get targets for employment. And do you know what? We're actually burning right the way through them on a lot of levels because it's the right thing to do. And we're actually investing in people despite a real lack of concentrated and strategic procurement that actually should meet Scotland's aims and what Scotland needs. And Mike hit the nail absolutely on the head earlier about, there's so many communities across this country that you walk out the door and it's just grey. There's no colour. There's no vibrancy in these environments. And you know what? There's such a big opportunity to change that. And it's not going to cost any more real physical money or not much more physical money. But again, it's that lack of understanding of end out value. It's all very transactional. It's not about, the real societal changes that's needed in this country to make a difference.
Mike, you spoke briefly about some frustrations, if I may use that word, between sort of the private and the public sector, and your view on that, and about perhaps the private sector being more agile in the way that it can work. Do you appreciate, though, the hands tied type of work that the public sector has because of red tape and regulations? And perhaps government regulations and so on?
Oh, listen, absolutely. I have worked, with the public sector over many years, and I know so many fantastic people there who just get into a kind of, I can't do this. It's not my department. And, you want to release people, to allow them to collaborate across departments, to lead beyond authority, to break through those barriers that hold people back. I think that businesses are doing well just now. Not all businesses, but businesses are much more nimble because they're more fleet of foot, because they have to respond to what's happening around. They have to respond. The public sector both has to respond and create the fertile environment in which the private sector can operate, not by putting whole lots of restraints, but by saying, we've got to work together on this. We're now talking about 15-minute cities. This is going to be something right across the world, where people are expected to live no more than 50 minutes walk from all the things they need in life. Now, we've got lots of areas around Scotland, around Britain, where that is not the case. The motor car still dominates our cities. And, we've given the motor car a brilliant quality of life. We've even got houses for motor cars. And we've got people sleeping out in the streets. I know that's a bit trite, but, we've got to reevaluate what a city is like, and we can transform them. And it doesn't take a lot, and give communities the ability to be creative about their own community. The one great thing about traveling around the world used to be that everywhere was entirely different. You'd land and music would be different, the food would be different, and we've got this kind of homogenization. Let's remove that homogenization. If you arrive in a train in Edinburgh, you want to find something of Edinburgh there. If you go on to Kirkcaldy or Arbroath, you want to find something, different, because people like, having a sense of history, a sense of heritage, and we've not created enough distinction between neighbourhoods, never mind cities. And this is a great opportunity to change that. And it is a partnership between the private and the public sector. And my criticism of the public sector is that the restraints that are put on by leadership are sometimes just too much, and they could get much more out of people if they allow them to fly a bit. And don't start every conversation with, where's the budget coming from? Because sometimes the simplest tasks, the ones that have the greatest impact, cost nothing. And I just quote Mayor Jaime Lerner, who transformed the city of Curitiba in southern Brazil. I mean, transformation. The most used public transport system in the world. 45.6 meters of green space per citizen, and the motor car being reduced to a sideway necessity, because the public sector system was so good. But he said, take 1 0 off the budget, you've got creativity. Take 2 zeros off the budget, and you've got genuine sustainability. But he said you're going to beat off the naysayers, the complexity sellers, those people that need to set up a complexity of paperwork, of systems. We don't need them. I know we need regulation, but regulation should be the facilitation of good practice, not the prevention of creativity. And I think, I've talked to housing associations recently who think the housing regulator just restrains them from doing anything creative at all. And that's nonsense. I've talked to the regulator and they say we want, housing associations to be innovative. So where is the truth in that? Somehow, we've created a spaghetti of structures, and this is a time to liberate ourselves and to be absolutely certain about where we want to go. Livable cities.
I'm coming on to my final question, and I want to just spend a little bit of time on this before we finish, because I think it's really, really important, and it's the same question to both of you gentlemen. Stephen, first of all, we have just seen the first year anniversary of the lockdown in the UK for COVID. What do you think, as organisations and businesses, what have we learnt over the past year in terms of emotional intelligence, in terms of kindness, in terms of treating people perhaps a little bit better? Have we learned lessons, and will we continue to learn lessons?
Good question, first of all, Gary, and it's interesting because I think it depends on the people I interact with. So I wouldn't say that I haven't got a universal answer for you. So I could answer you from the organisation that I work within, or other organisations I work around, or the community I live in. And I think from a community perspective, I think there's been a definite change in kindness and understanding that we're all in this together. But I think that at its peak, absolutely. But I actually think that's ebbing away now. I think people are frustrated and have a lot of issues bubbling away in the background that is building up and building up. And I think in the next 6 to 8 weeks, there's going to be a lot of pent up release as, lockdown comes out. If you remember, we were told at the beginning of October, it's like a fire break. Then all of a sudden, we've been like this for quite a long time. Certainly from a work perspective and a leadership perspective, I have noticed a distinct change in an acceptance that you don't need to be sat behind a desk 45 hours a week by lots of people that you wouldn't have done normally. And I've also understand that people are wanting to look out for people. They are wanting to make them feel that they are cared for and wanted and thought about. And I really recognize that in my own organization. And that's difficult because we're talking to each other on this platform. And from my personal perspective, I like a lot of energy in the room. I like to feel, and that's difficult. But yeah, I think it depends. Is what I'm saying.
And I think what you're saying there is leadership is going to be even more crucial.
Absolutely.
over the next couple of weeks.
Emotional intelligence is so important.
Mike, final word to you based on that same question. What have we learned?
I've seen, quite a change. I've seen people collaborating in a way that they didn't before, which is strange because they're not able to meet. Because this whole digital world has opened us up to meet people from across nations and across sectors. I see a lot more concern about mental health, a real attempt by organizations all over the country, all over the world, to think about the welfare of their people and to think about the kind of climate that's needed to create this, psychological safe place. Actually, that sounds quite, restrictive. Somewhere where people flourish, a bit like a farmer. You're nurturing people who all have different strengths, who respond to different environments, and that is becoming much more prominent in the way that leaders are talking to me. But also, I think we're going to see a reshape. Offices will become maybe culture hubs. People will work from home much more often. And when they meet each other, they'll be far more enthused by each other. I heard a quote from someone last week said, "I miss the company, but I don't miss the office politics." So I think we've got an enormous opportunity. And I am very optimistic about the future because I think we've learned things about ourselves. We've learned things about people outside ourselves. We've learned things about what the environment looks like when it's not, packed with motor cars. And I think we've learned something about, what organizations can do to function much more effectively, because we've learned that you don't need people to sit around a briefing room in the morning to get their instructions before they start work. And, Microsoft in Japan reduced their working week from 5 to 4 days. You know what the result was? Productivity went up 40%. That says it all.
So I think, to summarize there, Mike, it's about leaders being brave and taking decisions that we wouldn't have ordinarily, or they wouldn't have ordinarily taken previously.
I think it's about boldness. And I think that a lot of leaders have inherited, habits and an idea of the work culture from their past experience. And I think now people are broken from that because we haven't been in the workplace. And I think boldness is now the way forward. And leaders that are bold and not frightened to let go and are able to release people to be creative and be the best of themselves will reap the benefits.
Gentlemen, well, that's our 60 minutes up, almost to the second. Stephen, Mike, thank you so much for a wonderful, insightful 60 minutes. And as I said, I'm sure that we could have got another episode out of some of the comments that have been made. I noticed that our comment board they're off the scale. So it'll be really interesting to see some of the comments that have come in and also on Twitter as well. Stephen Slessor, Mike Stephenson, thank you very much. From me, Gary Robinson, that's it for this series. I don't know when we'll be back. I do know for a fact that there are discussions happening behind the scenes, way above my pay grade, to hopefully bring back the series at some point this year. But we'd love to hear from you, particularly if you've been a viewer for the past 6 months. Give us your opinions, give us your thoughts, and let us know what you would like to hear and what you'd like to hear, in which direction the conversation you would like it to head in. Around ACEs and ACE Aware Nation. Give us your suggestions. Use all the usual social media channels, and you never know, I might be back sooner than you think. Wonderful. I've enjoyed your company. Thank you very much indeed. Please continue to stay safe and look after each other. And until we meet again, see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.